What unexplained memories do you have from your childhood? Story 1. I have a story that was a mystery until a few years ago. When I was 5, I had a big bay window that faced into our backyard. One night, I was sitting in bed with the curtains open, reading, when I suddenly heard a loud thump on the window. I looked up and saw what appeared to be a zombie pressed up against my window, staring at me with filmy eyes. I immediately froze, not knowing what to do. I was the kind of kid who never had nightmares, wasn't afraid of the dark, and I knew monsters weren't real. But there one was, slowly sliding down the window. Screaming, I ran out of the room, practically shaking in fear, to my grandparents. Once they finally calmed me down and got me to talk, they took me outside and showed me there was nothing there. That might have been the end of it. But when I woke up in the morning, there was a greasy smear on the window and what looked like little pieces of something under it. However, when I pointed this out to my grandparents, they said maybe a bird had hit it or something, and that was the end of it. For years after this, I was terrified of the dark, had to have nightlights everywhere, and even wet the bed a couple of times because the hallway was too dark to get to the restroom. I also started having really bad nightmares because of it. So this was an unexplained mystery to me for almost 20 years. Then a couple Thanksgivings ago, my family was talking about weird things that had happened to us. I told my story, and my uncle started laughing uncontrollably. Once he could breathe again, he told me what had really happened. At the time, my uncle was living in the house next door to us. He had a friend who worked in special effects for movies and had asked my uncle to let her refine the makeup look she was working on for a floating corpse. It turns out he was coming home from that, still had the makeup on because he wanted his wife to see it, and noticed me in bed when he cut through our backyard as a shortcut. Thinking it'd be funny, he slammed against the window to scare me, then went home and forgot about it for years, leaving me traumatized and mentally scarred. Story 2. Back when I was about 6 or 7, I lived in a different house than I do now. My mom tucked me into bed like on any normal night. But when I woke up, I was in a very tight space. It was pitch black, I couldn't see, and I felt very cramped. I started screaming for help. After what seemed like 5 minutes of screaming and some crying, something jerked whatever I was in, and I heard a zipping noise. I then saw my dad's face looking down at me. I was inside of a suitcase. It turns out I was in a suitcase under the guest room's bed, where no one was sleeping. No one in my family knows how I ended up there or why it happened. It's not just a weird dream or something, because my family still brings it up sometimes. Completely strange, and I still don't know how it happened. Story 3. My father passed away when I was 3 years old. I vividly remember walking to the bed where he lay after he died, seeing his face with a strange purple hue and a bit of chicken soup my mother had been trying to get him to eat, still running down the left side of his face. I remember not crying, just feeling very confused. Then I walked out of the room, went to my bedroom, and watched Power Rangers. To this day, my mother, who has never lied to me, strongly insists that she had a neighbor take me to their house as soon as my father began to pass away, and that I never saw him in that state. She says that by the time I returned to the house, the room had already been shut and locked for quite a while. The rest of my siblings confirm this, but my memory persists. Nobody ever told me what he looked like when he died, let alone that he had aspirated chicken soup. I have no idea where the memory comes from, but that's the point of this story, so here it is. Edit. I've spoken to my mom about this multiple times, and she has told me that I described what I saw to her days before she had spoken to anyone about it. It's possible that this is a fabricated memory from overhearing others, but I find that unlikely, since I spent most of the following days with neighbors who were very careful not to talk in front of the children about what had happened. Story 4. I had a memory years ago of being in an Arabic-feeling country, in someone's house, and my mother was trying on a sari, but I remembered it with a great deal of fear. Decades later, not long before he passed away, I asked my father about it, and he delivered. We traveled to Tunisia. This had to be around 1968, and we'd ended up with an invitation to dinner at some wealthy person's house. My mother was very outgoing and used to end up talking to all sorts of people. My father too, come to think of it. The scene took place much as I had described it. But what neither my father nor I knew was that the host was running his foot up and down my mother's leg under the table all throughout dinner. My mother, who often described herself as not very smart, but was in fact nothing of the sort, Growing up in the 40s in Australia wasn't a good time for women. Didn't react. My father had a temper. It would have gone very badly. As my father said when he told me this was Tunisia in the 60s. If a few tourists had vanished or been found in an alley, there would have been no consequences. She totally pulled it off. Mum was incredible. They've both been gone for 20 years, and I still miss them almost every day. Story 5. I was maybe 3 or 4. We were at my mom's co-worker's house for some get-together. The co-worker's daughter and I were pretty good friends. We decided to play hide-and-seek from our parents, without them knowing. We got into one of the unlocked cars in the driveway. Eventually, we got bored and started exploring the car. My friend found some nail polish, which was actually whiteout, and we started painting our nails. About 10 minutes later, our moms found us, and they had tears running down their faces. They wouldn't tell us why. Later, when I was older, my mom told me that the reason they were so upset was that the one compartment in the car we hadn't opened had a loaded firearm inside. The owner of the car ended up becoming a good family friend, like a grandfather to me. He never cleaned up the whiteout mess on his dashboard until he sold the car. He kept it as a reminder to always lock up the firearm in his vehicle. I'm not sure why this story sticks out so much in my memory. I just vividly remember the absolute fear on my mom's face. Story 6. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, there was this creek in the forest behind my house that I used to play at all the time. One side of the creek was bordered by a dirt wall about 5 feet high. I used to jump over the creek from one side to the other. It was fun to pretend like I knew parkour. Then one day I went out to the creek, and lying in the middle of it was a football. Now I want to mention an important detail. The creek's depth made it so that the top half of the football stuck out of the water. The top half was completely dry, so it wasn't like the ball just rolled into the creek. It had been placed there. Where things started to get really strange was that written on top of the football in black permanent marker was, "My first name Jumps," and underneath that phrase was a phone number. To make that clear, if my name was Johnny, it would have said Johnny Jumps with a phone number written underneath it. I picked up the football and went home, obviously very confused and kind of scared. Whoever put that ball there had been watching me. They placed it directly where I would jump over the creek when I would play by myself. I grabbed the cordless phone and called the number. It was the number to Homeland Security. Yes, Homeland Security. The number you call when you believe there's a national emergency. It was basically like super emergency services, especially since this was only a few years after 9/11. I quickly tried to explain my situation to the lady on the phone, and she told me it was okay and to not call the number again. I instantly ran and told my mom what had just happened, and she was just as confused as I was. My dad, my parents were divorced, came over later that evening to drop something off, and I told him what happened. He asked me to give him the football and said he was going to look into it. I gave it to him, and he left a few minutes later. Over the next few days, I kept asking if he ever figured anything out, and he would give me vague answers or try to dodge the question. This turned into a few weeks of me asking, which then turned into a few months, until he started acting like he didn't know what I was talking about. That was around 10 years ago, and if I ask him about it now, he says he has no memory of this ever happening. He doesn't remember the football at all. My mom does, but vaguely. To this day, I have absolutely no idea who was watching me, why they put a football in the creek, why they wrote "My name Jumps" on it, and especially why they included the number to Homeland Security. I never really thought much of this incident until I was older and realized just how unsettling the whole thing was. I continued to live by that creek for a few more years and kept playing there until I moved away. All of my neighbors were very friendly, suburban, upper middle class neighborhood, and I knew them all personally. None of them ever gave me a weird feeling, and nothing else unusual ever happened during the 12 years I lived there. Story 7. When I was a preteen, about 12, my dad came into my room with the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, wanting to look through it with me. He sat down on my bed and asked me my opinion on a few of the women. When I didn't seem interested, naturally because this was extremely awkward, he left it on my bed and said I could take a look at it whenever I wanted. I left it on my bed untouched out of fear that this was some sort of trap or test until my mother found it a few hours later. She asked me where I had gotten it, and I shrugged. "I don't know. Dad left it there." "Why did he do that?" "I don't know," I answered truthfully. So she grabbed the magazine and stormed off to find my dad. I was then treated to overhearing an hour-long argument between the two of them. All I specifically remember is my mom asking him why he thought I should have a swimsuit magazine. "I don't want him to get strange ideas about stuff," was his response. Years later, it dawned on me that my dad thought I was gay, and this was his way of testing that theory. These days, my dad is completely accepting of everyone. But while I'm confident he would have loved me either way, I think at the time he was just a little uncomfortable with the idea of his son possibly being gay. The twist? I'm straight and used to sneak into their room to find that magazine all the time. Story 8. This'll probably get buried, but here goes. 7th grade, I was moving to a new town. There was a mudroom, basically a space for boots, coats, etc., in my old house that had a huge firewood box inside. The room next door was often rented out to working young adults in their late 20s. My family lived upstairs. I was cleaning out the mudroom as we were moving out, and I found something strange behind the firewood box. A small, flesh-colored bundle with black beady eyes. I thought it was some weird animal that had gotten in. We lived in the mountains. So I just dumped it in the garbage with the rest of the scrap firewood and trash and didn't think anything of it. Later that year, when I took education, I pretty much realized what I had seen. A fetus. I occasionally wonder what actually happened and what in the world I found. Story 9. This story takes place when I was around 8 or 9 years old. One night, I was abruptly woken up at around 3 in the morning. As I was adjusting the blankets, trying to get comfortable, something caught my eye. My door was slightly cracked, and the light coming from the hallway looked different from any other night. The light fixture usually gave off a yellowish tint, but this time it looked pure white. Half asleep but curious about the unusual light, I sat up. That's when it got strange. The second I sat up, I heard a voice say, "Don't move." Now fully awake and aware of my surroundings, I began to question what I just heard. A million thoughts went through my head. I decided to test it and moved again. The same voice responded, this time a little more sternly, "Don't move." At this point, I was panicking. I mentally listed everyone who could be in the house. My dad was the only other male, but the voice wasn't his. I stayed frozen on my side for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I convinced myself to move one more time. I was so hyper-aware, I was sure I'd be able to tell who it was or where the voice was coming from. So I prepared myself and slowly laid back down. The second my head hit the pillow, I heard it again. "Don't move!" This time practically yelling. I was so scared I wet the bed. That's when I knew it wasn't my dad. He has a thick accent, and this voice didn't. I was too afraid to move again. I stayed there with all my senses on high alert until 5 a.m. Eventually, I was so exhausted, I fell back asleep. I woke up a couple of hours later, still damp and still in the same position. It was daylight, so I jumped out of bed and ran to tell my parents. For the next 2 weeks, I refused to sleep in that room. My parents, being very religious, even got the church involved. Story 10. When I was a kid, I had a hard time sleeping and would always call my mom because I got scared. Every time she came in, I would ask for a glass of water. I was about 4 or 5. Even though I was being a bit much, my mom never did more than sigh heavily. During the day, she would tell me I needed to try going back to sleep on my own. But that was it. One night, I woke up scared like usual, called my mom, and asked for a glass of water. I waited for her to come back. She walked in looking upset and didn't have a glass of water. She told me to go back to bed and stop being such a baby. She fussed at me for about a minute before abruptly walking out. Not even a full minute later, not enough time to get from the kitchen to my room, let alone change clothes, my mom came in again, wearing a different colored nightgown and holding a glass of water. She laid down next to me and told me everything was okay and to go back to sleep. I asked her why she changed her nightgown, and she told me she hadn't been back in since I asked for water. I remember being a little scared of her the next day. I still don't know what that was. Story 11. We were living in a really old house in Springfield, Illinois. I was probably 10 years old. The previous owner, an elderly woman, had passed away in one of the rooms downstairs. That room became my stepfather's office and computer room. We had a giant bookshelf on one side of the door, completely stocked with medical books and journals. Needless to say, it easily weighed over 1,000 pounds, probably more. One day while I was on the computer, I got up and walked out of the room to run to the bathroom. I had only taken a few steps when the door slammed shut and a horrible shaking sound came from the room. I ran and grabbed my mom. She tried to open the door, freaking out, convinced that someone must be in there. But the door wouldn't budge at all. So we ran outside to the yard and looked through the window into that room. The room was empty, the window was still locked from the inside, and the fresh paint on the edges was still sealed. But now the giant bookshelf had been moved about 6 feet over and was sitting directly in front of the door. No books were out of place, and it had only been a couple of moments. It would have taken several people to move that bookshelf when it was empty, let alone fully stocked with books. And yet here it was, moved almost across the room. My mom is convinced it was the woman's spirit. I don't know if I believe that, but it's definitely hard to explain. We had a few other strange things happen in that house. Like one day when thick smoke with a smell like incense from a religious ceremony started billowing out of the basement. When we went down there was no sign of anything that could have caused it. Story 12. One strange thing for me is that I have extremely vivid memories of hearing voices only when I drank apple juice. It went away eventually as I got older, but it would sound like someone saying something from really far away. My young mind rationalized it as sound waves from people across the world somehow reaching my ears. I even remember asking my mom if that was possible. During a vacation while staying at a family member's house, they had a bunch of old toys upstairs for me to play with alone. I specifically remember playing with one that had a really odd face, and it would change every time I looked at it. I also remember it moving in front of my face. It almost looked like how things morph or shift on certain substances. That same night, I had a dream about being in a new room at the top of the stairs that didn't actually exist. I was looking down and saw that toy walking up the stairs. None of it scared me back then, but it's definitely unsettling in hindsight. I hadn't even seen any scary movies at that point. Another time when I was about 6 or 7, I woke up in the middle of the night sweating in my bed, with every single light in my room turned on. I had no idea what was going on or who turned them on, so I just got up, turned them off, and went back to sleep. I asked my parents about it the next day, and they just said I had probably been sleepwalking, even though I never had before or since. Story 13. This one isn't about me, but about my boyfriend, and I've never seen him so emotional when talking about any part of his past. When he was about 4 or 5, he woke up in his room but had no idea who he was or where he was. He sat there for a while, trying to recognize something, anything. Nothing came. It was just a blank slate. He walked out of his bedroom into the hallway and saw a woman, his mom. He asked her if she was his mother. She laughed, thinking he was just being silly, and said yes. He looked out the window and saw a man standing by the mailbox. Assuming it was his dad, he ran out and asked, "Are you my dad?" The man replied, "Of course I am, son." Then my boyfriend asked, "What's my name?" His dad told him, but even then, he couldn't remember anything. As far as he knows, that was the very first day of his life. He spent the rest of the day sad and scared. Eventually, he got used to things, but he still remembers that day very vividly and is haunted by it. He's afraid that something bad happened just before that, and he repressed the memories. Story 14. One of my earliest memories in life is waking up in a hospital bed with doctors or nurses all around me. They were telling me they were going to remove a catheter and were joking about my name. My name is Heracles, and I remember one guy saying his name was Xena. Apparently, I had gotten very sick with meningitis and was admitted to the hospital. I was in a coma for a while, but I can't remember for how long. I have one memory from a few days before I got sick, according to my mom. I have no other memories from before or shortly after this, and I also have trouble placing it on my life timeline. It feels more like a dream than a memory, and it's a strange feeling, knowing that part of my life only through what others told me. It's not exactly unexplained, since I was told what happened, but it still feels that way to me. Story 15. My parents' friends had a daughter who was about 2 years older than me. Our family went on holiday with their family a couple of times. This girl had a small piece of cloth. She told me that the cloth had been given to her in the middle of the night by a spirit. The spirit, she said, looked exactly like her, but had a different hairstyle. I remember not questioning this at all. I accepted it completely. One time I vividly remember, or maybe badly misremember, but it feels real and vivid, was when I was about 4 or 5, and the girl and I were in the back of my mom's car on our way to a holiday. My mom was driving, and the girl's mom was in the passenger seat. Our dads and older brothers were in another car. As we traveled down the motorway toward Devon, the girl said to me, "Watch this." She took a hair clip and wrapped it in the cloth. When I wrap this cloth around anything, it moves somewhere else, but never very far away. When she unwrapped the cloth, the hair clip had vanished. This amazed me. We searched all around the back seat of the car until I found it. It was clipped to my seatbelt above my shoulder. I accepted totally that the cloth had powers, but now I see it was simple sleight of hand that could easily fool a 4-year-old. Next, she took my toy Matchbox car that I was holding in my hand. It was a model of a green Ford Escort. I still have it somewhere. She put the toy car in the cloth and wrapped it up. When she unwrapped it, the car was gone. This time, though, we couldn't find it anywhere in the back of the car. We searched and eventually gave up. I remember feeling frustrated that my toy had gone missing. An hour later, the girl's mother turned around from the front seat and asked me, "Is this yours?" In her hand was the Matchbox green Ford Escort. She said she had found it in the glove compartment. "Wow," I said. "I had this in the back seat and Sarah made it disappear." "No, it was in the glove box," my mom replied. This upset me. I cried a lot, and my mom told me not to be silly and said the car must have been there the whole time. The girl's mom said there was no such thing as magic and insisted it must have been there before we left. What unsettles me is that if it was all just a joke, then my mom and her friend would have had to be in on it. And even though I was visibly distressed, they kept up the story as if nothing was strange. That's what still bothers me. Story 16. When I was in the 5th grade, my teacher once asked me to take a slip of paper down to the teacher's lounge and give it to someone there. I assumed it was something school-related and unimportant, but on the way I unfolded it, and the only thing written on it were the words, "Keep him there for 15 minutes." My stomach turned. When I got to the teacher's lounge and handed the note to the staff member, she proceeded to fumble around looking for something for 15 minutes, then finally handed me a random stack of papers to bring back to the teacher. When I returned to the classroom, everyone was clearly looking at me strangely. A few days later, I asked a friend about it, and he was evasive. I became paranoid and curious afterward, but nothing else seemed unusual. I was always a smart kid, and this was long before any rebellious phase or behavior issues. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. Why was I singled out like that? What happened in that classroom during those 15 minutes? It obviously involved me, but nothing beyond that ever came to light. I've moved past it and it doesn't bother me anymore. Maybe I had been unkind to someone and the teacher used the time to talk about it as a lesson in kindness. But I wasn't really that kind of kid. At this point, I accept that whatever happened probably had to do with some behavior I'd exhibited, and that whatever it was has long since been lost in the years of development and growth that followed. But that question still lingers, and I do think about it from time to time. Story 17. My mom and I made this fairy house together by hot gluing a bunch of sticks to form a little hut. I was around 5 or 6. It was kind of like a dollhouse cut in half. It was really detailed. We glued moss to the bottom as carpet. I remember running into the woods and scraping some off a rock. We made a tiny pine cone chair by pulling off some of the outer pieces to shape it, added a little table and a few more details. We placed it in the woods near my house, inside a fairy circle made of mushrooms. It was super fun, and my mom told me we made it for the fairies. And because I had been so generous and helped create it from forest materials just for them, they might leave me little gifts. And they did. I found sea glass, a golden seashell. Later I found out it had been painted, and other small trinkets. Of course, my mom was the one leaving the gifts. She was smart. She spaced them out so I wouldn't lose interest too quickly. Eventually, the weather took its toll, and nature reclaimed the house. But on the last visit I made to the fairy house, I saw something tiny shoot up into the sky, with sparkling, glittery stuff trailing behind it, like a glowing tail. Basically, it looked like something magical. I found a crystal left inside the fairy house and rushed back inside to show my mom and tell her what I'd seen. She told me later she had never seen the crystal before and had no idea how it got there. I still wonder if I imagined it, or if maybe, just maybe, I actually saw a fairy. Story 18. When I was 4 years old, lying in bed, my closet light suddenly came on. At the time, the closet door was at the foot of my bed, and my bed was on the same wall. To turn on the light inside the closet, you had to flip the switch from the inside. For some reason, I wasn't scared. Usually, as a kid, I hated the dark and everything made me nervous. But I felt calm. The door opened, and out stepped a beautiful lady. She had freckles and brown curly hair. She was wearing white. As she stepped out, she quickly appeared by my side. Still, I wasn't freaking out. She told me she was an angel. I asked her why she was here, and she said she was sent to watch over me. I laid out a Michael Jordan sleeping bag and a dinosaur pillow. She thanked me for being hospitable. She told me to go to sleep, and I did. The next day, I woke up, and the sleeping bag was folded neatly with the pillow placed on top. I asked my mom and dad, and they said no one had come into my room. My dad had been up late in the living room watching TV, and my mom was on the phone most of the night talking to an old friend overseas. It always puzzled me why she showed up and how I can remember every detail of that night. But that's an unexplained memory I've had ever since. Story 19. I might be a little late here, but I'll try. As a kid with very little money, I was fascinated by shiny or colorful objects. Things like fake gems, gold chocolate coins, or cool Pokemon cards. One year at the book fair, I saw this amazing purple gem-shaped eraser that fit on top of a pencil. I wanted it so badly, but it cost $3, and I knew it would be irresponsible to spend my lunch money on it. Fast forward a bit. During the walk back to the classroom, I saw the exact eraser I wanted just lying on the hallway floor. I picked it up quickly and put it in my pocket. Now here's the part I still don't understand. Later in class, a girl started crying because she had lost the eraser she had just bought from the book fair. Everyone began looking for it, and I got this deep, sinking feeling in my stomach. I realized the eraser I picked up was probably hers. I walked outside to think about what to do. After a long moment of reflection, I decided to give it back. I went inside, took it from my pocket, and handed it to her. She thanked me, and I went back outside and cried because I had wanted that eraser so badly. After crying for maybe a minute, I got ready to go back in. But just before walking inside, I reached into my pocket, and somehow the same eraser was there. Same color, same shape, same gem-like design. I stared at it in disbelief and looked through the classroom window. She still had her eraser in her hand. I checked again, and again. It was still there. I still don't know how that second eraser ended up in my pocket. It's one of those unexplained things that has stayed with me, and it's a big reason why I try to treat others with kindness and an open heart. Story 20. I've been waiting for this kind of question forever, but it's probably too late now and this will get buried. I was probably about 5 years old, sleeping at my aunt's house on her porch with my twin brother. We were in sleeping bags right next to the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. That night was filled with bad dreams and restless sleep. At one point, I woke up and looked through the glass door. Outside, I saw a small dog with enormous eyes. It looked like a chihuahua, maybe like the one from the old fast food commercials. It was bathed in a pale, ghostly blue light and just stared at me. I was about a foot away from it, with only the glass between us. I eventually fell back asleep, only to wake up again later. And it was still there. The dog hadn't moved. This happened several times throughout the night. Every time I opened my eyes, the dog was there, unmoving, just staring. By the morning, it was gone. I told my parents and my aunt. She said no one in her neighborhood had a dog like that, and all her gates were locked. She's never owned a dog in her life. That memory stuck with me for years. Then about 15 years later, my aunt was renovating her home, and my brother and I went over to help move things out. While we were on that same porch, my brother said something like, "I hated sleeping here as a kid. That light outside was way too bright, and I always had nightmares. I was scared of the cat that watched me through the glass." He described the exact same experience, but saw it as a cat instead of a dog. Same night, same porch, same presence. Whatever it was, that strange creature left a lasting impression on both of us. I think I'll tell this story to my kids one day as a campfire ghost story. Story 21. When I was around 3 years old, I fell down my grandmother's steps. They were steep, not easy for a little kid on wobbly legs. I ended up with a black eye and some bruises. I swear I remember this happening, but no one else believes me. After that, for about 2 years, every time I stood at the top of those stairs, something would lift me up and gently carry me down, placing me at the landing by the kitchen. Almost every Sunday night, we had dinner at her house. I remember wishing that I could keep floating all the way into the kitchen so everyone would see me and be amazed. But instead, I was always gently set down right at the bottom of the steps. One day, a couple of years later, I stood at the top of the stairs and nothing happened. I tried really hard, but I didn't move. So I just walked down the stairs and it never happened again. There's one strange detail about all this. My great-grandfather, on the other side of the family, passed away 6 days before I was born. He died after falling down the stairs while carrying an air conditioner. I've always wondered, could he have been the one helping me down the stairs all those times? Story 22. Living in a regular suburban community, there were a lot of families with children around the same age. Somewhere between age 3 and 5, a family moved in just down the block with two girls, one slightly older than me and one slightly younger. I would play with both of them, as would many of the other kids in the neighborhood. One day I had to use the bathroom, and since we were closer to their house, they offered theirs. The younger girl said that before I could use it, she had to show me something, and show me she did. She had male genitalia. I honestly thought nothing of it at the time and continued with my day, then used the bathroom. I think I mentioned it to my older sister later, but she just brushed it off. Thinking about it years later, I don't know if she was in tears, I didn't see anything else to confirm this, or perhaps she simply identified as female, and her parents allowed her to express herself that way. I believe they were renting the house and eventually moved away, and I never saw them again. Story 23. When I was a young child, my grandparents gave me a 3-foot-tall doll named Sally. I was absolutely terrified of her. She became the monster in every single one of my night terrors. Every night before bed, I would turn her around to face the corner. She had those creepy eyes that opened and closed. One night before my parents tucked me into bed, I felt especially frightened of the Sally doll. So I wrapped her up like a mummy using my baby blankets and her doll clothes, put her inside a black garbage bag, tied it, and taped it shut. I then placed her in the very back of my closet. After that, I felt confident that my makeshift doll prison would keep me safe and went to sleep. Imagine my terrified surprise when I woke up the next morning to find her out of the closet, completely unwrapped, and sitting in my kiddie chair right next to my bed. I screamed as loud as I could, jumped out of bed, and ran out of the room like my life depended on it. To this day, my parents swear they never touched the doll. They didn't even know it was missing the night before, or that I had wrapped it up and hidden it. My younger brother couldn't have done it. He was just as scared of that doll as I was. After that incident, my brother and I tore Sally's limbs off, with our parents' permission, and my dad threw her out with the garbage. I still have no idea how that doll got out, got unwrapped, and ended up beside my bed. Story 24. Throwaway because I like to think I'm not imagining things. When I was about 9 or 10, I used to sleep alone in the top bunk of a small bunk bed. One night, I remember trying to fall asleep but feeling this overwhelming sense of fear. It came out of nowhere, but I'd been scared of the dark before, so I tried to brush it off. I was lying in bed, every sense on high alert. At the foot of my bed and to the right was my bedroom door, which opened into a long hallway leading to my brother's room. Suddenly, I heard someone start walking slowly down the hall. The steps were tentative, with creaks in the floor, followed by long pauses. Eventually, I gathered the courage to call out softly, "Dad?" The noise stopped. It sounded like someone was shifting their weight on the old floorboards. I sat upright in bed, sweating and nervous, and called again, "Dad?" This time, I saw a faint shadow start to move into the doorway. Before I could fully register what I was seeing, I threw myself under the covers and pressed against the wall. I don't know how long I stayed like that, trying to decide whether to scream. Eventually, I peeked out. I saw a figure, and what I noticed first was its clothing. It had a small diamond-shaped pattern, gray in color, though it was hard to tell in the dark. I felt a wave of relief when I thought it was my dad's pajamas. I threw off the covers and said something like, "Dad, I just had a nightmare." But it wasn't my dad. Standing just 4 feet away was a figure, gray, with large black eyes. Its head had 2 strange bumps, and it had 2 horizontal nostrils. Years later, when I saw an image of the typical alien figure, I froze, because it looked just like the thing I saw. The detail that stuck with me the most was the expression it had. It looked surprised. Not scared, just surprised that I had revealed myself. That's where my memory cuts off. I remember everything up to that moment so clearly, but I don't remember what happened next. I don't remember being scared the next morning. I don't remember running to my parents. I don't even remember being afraid the night after. I've experienced sleep paralysis since then, and maybe it was a dream, but the clarity of that memory still haunts me, and I've never been able to fully explain what happened. Story 25. From about the age of 8 to 11, I lived in a house with a dilapidated garage and a large rusted kerosene, or possibly oil tank in the backyard. I don't know what it was about that spot, but that corner of the yard had a really gloomy vibe, and I would see all kinds of strange things around there. One afternoon, I was in my room and looked out the window to see a huge black canine forelimb reach out from between the padlocked swing doors of the garage and claw furiously at the outer surface. The wood was rotting away in places, and the lock and chain had a bit of give, just enough to let one leg squeeze through. My immediate thought was that a neighborhood dog had gotten in there, and maybe my mom had accidentally locked it inside. I ran outside and opened the door, but there was nothing alive inside. There was no other exit from the garage aside from a couple of high windows which were locked, and judging by the size of the paw, we're talking Great Dane scale, there's no way an animal like that could have been hiding anywhere in there. Another time, my mom was looking for something in the garage at night, I don't remember what, and she called me out to help. There was no light in the garage, so we were searching in almost total darkness. After a minute or two, I looked through the window at the far end of the garage and saw the silhouette of a human figure sitting cross-legged on top of the kerosene tank. It was outlined against the glow of light pollution in the sky. The figure was waving its arms above its head in a rigid, deliberate way, like it was signaling something. I shouted to my mom that someone was out there waving, but she didn't even look. She just told me to stop being silly and sent me back into the house. In truth, I think what I said scared her, and she didn't want to stay in the garage any longer. There were other strange things too, but this post is long enough already. Story 26. When I was young, I could tell when I was dreaming. Like really well, I could take control and make myself do things. Not so much anymore. One of the ways I dealt with nightmares was by realizing it was a dream, running away to give myself some time, laying down on the ground, closing my eyes and counting to 3. 1, 2, 3. Then I would sit up really hard and open my eyes. And I would sit up in real life, fully awake. I used to be really good at lucid dreaming. Another thing I'd do if I didn't like the dream I was in was just end it. If I was in some weird pod floating across lava, I'd just bail into the lava and wake up. But one time it really messed with me. My plan for dealing with nightmares had never failed before. I was having a nightmare, so I went for the usual 1, 2, 3 trick. It worked. I sat up in my bed with my eyes open. I decided to go downstairs and get a drink, and then I was suddenly stabbed in the chest. I had dreamt that I stopped dreaming, but I was still dreaming the whole time. When I woke up for real, I was shaken. I wasn't even sure if I was really awake. I had never been caught off guard like that. That dream scared me in a way nothing else ever has. And honestly, sometimes I wonder, what if I'm still dreaming? Story 27. Sorry I'm late to the thread. I'm not sure if anyone will even see this, but I finally found a post I can relate to. As a kid, I didn't really have nightmares, and I wasn't scared of much. When I was about 6 or 7, I was visiting my dad. My parents are divorced, and he was taking me back to my mom's house. I remember we stopped at Taco Bell. He had an older white car with black stripes, and it had one of those openings in the back seat that lets you access the trunk. I opened it and found some baby dolls. The plastic kind with plush bodies. Their eyes opened and closed when you tilted them. My dad let me keep them, and I was thrilled. That night, I left the dolls on the stairs before going to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. It was dark, but we had nightlights in the hallway. As I walked past the stairs, I saw the doll still sitting there. I picked one up, looked at it, and I swear this wasn't a dream. Its head started turning, and its eyes opened and closed on their own. I threw that doll and ran like never before. To this day, I don't know what happened to those dolls. No one seems to remember them, not even my dad. Story 28. This happened when I was in preschool, but I remember it pretty clearly. My parents both worked at a university. The school had a child development research department, or something similar, which also served as a daycare called the Child Labs. Basically, you could send your child there for preschool and kindergarten at a low cost or even free, and in return, the staff would occasionally take notes on our behavior, observe us from behind one-way mirrors, or have us participate in simple tests. This was stuff like giving you a choice between 2 boxes, one that you could open immediately for a small prize, or one you had to wait a few minutes to open, which had a better prize. At the time, I had no idea this was a behavioral study. I figured it was just regular school. It never struck me as strange that there was a room with a one-way mirror at the back of the classroom. There is one thing that stands out in my memory as being very strange. I was out on the playground one day when I was called back inside early, before the rest of the kids. I remember being led down a hallway into a room that wasn't my usual classroom. The building had many different rooms, not all for play or class. They sat me down and gave me an injection of something. Now, this could be a distorted memory from when I was 4 years old, but some specific details still feel very clear and make it all seem odd. I had just received some new Thomas the Tank Engine toys and was really excited to play with them, but I couldn't bring them to the playground. So I was thrilled to go back inside early, thinking I'd get to play with them. Later, I told my mom what happened. She didn't believe me, not then, and not years later when I brought it up again. Maybe they weren't injecting anything and were just drawing blood. But either way, it's strange considering how simple and harmless the other experiments were. Story 29. I remember being in the storage space of a car, in the back, I'm not sure what it's called in English, with two other kids when I was about 5 years old. The only other thing I recall was that we were on our way to a windmill for some kind of birthday party. I never thought much of it until a few months ago when I remembered it again and realized how strange it was. Definitely not a safe place to put children during a car ride. I asked my parents about it. They said they would never allow something like that, and I can't imagine any parent doing that behind others' backs. To be honest, all I clearly remember is going to a party, though not the party itself. The weirdest part is that sometime that same year, I began having recurring nightmares. I don't remember exactly how long afterward, but we ended up moving not long after that. The nightmares were intense, and for years I was quiet and deeply withdrawn. I didn't even know why I felt that way. I only started to feel okay again recently. I started developing an early interest in certain themes, even before I understood them. I was strangely drawn to scenes on TV involving people being tied up or restrained. I've never told anyone this before, but I've started to suspect that something happened back then. There's no point in obsessing over it or trying to dig too deep. Whatever it was, it happened. Or maybe my brain filled in gaps while I was trying to make sense of years of feeling low. Still, writing this out is a bit of a relief. Story 30. One night when I was 7 years old, I was sitting in bed when I began to get this intense and unsettling feeling, like someone was watching me. I looked around and noticed that all the photographs of people in the room seemed to be staring directly at me. What was even more disturbing was that they all appeared to have worried expressions. It made the creepy feeling even worse. Then I began to have the sense that something dangerous was coming. It wasn't exactly hearing voices, but more like my own thoughts translating what the pictures were trying to tell me. Something bad was going to happen. The feeling became so overwhelming that I started screaming for my mom. When she came into the room, I was crying uncontrollably. I couldn't even explain to her what was wrong at first. Eventually, I calmed down enough to tell her what was happening and begged her to take down the photographs. Understandably, she got freaked out too, but she did what I asked, and eventually I was able to fall asleep. The next morning, the Whittier Narrows earthquake hit. We didn't live very far from the epicenter. Ever since that night, I noticed I would get that same feeling from photographs the day before an earthquake. Since moving out of Southern California, I haven't experienced that sensation again, but that night has stayed with me ever since. Story 31. When I was about 7, I remember getting off the bus from school, walking up my driveway and onto the porch, but I don't remember ever walking into the house. The next thing I knew, I was still outside on the front porch, and it was nighttime. I was wearing a black and purple gothic-looking dress, something I did not own, had never seen before, and definitely wasn't what I wore to school that day. I remember accepting the fact that I couldn't go inside the house and that I'd have to sleep on the porch. So I curled up on my dog's bed and stared out at the woodline, watching for night critters. I live in a wooded area and I'm terrified of the dark, so this was incredibly difficult for me. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up the next morning in my own bed. I asked my mom what I did that afternoon after school, and she told me I went about my usual routine, ate a corn dog, played with Barbies, watched some TV. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that's not how I remember that day at all. Story 32. This isn't really my memory, but my mom's. And it concerns something that happened when I was a child. She always tells me the story of the time she woke up in the middle of the night to see a little boy standing in her doorway. He looked like me and was about the same age. I was maybe 3 at the time, but he was wearing strange clothes. She says the boy pointed from her room toward mine and my brother's, and then she heard crying. She rushed past the boy and ran to check on us. I was asleep in bed, but my younger brother was crying and had a 104-degree fever. He ended up going to the hospital that night. My aunt, who lived nearby, said she also saw the same little boy that night, but I forget what happened at her house. What makes this story even stranger is that last year my friends and I visited an abandoned mental asylum. We went to explore and see how creepy it would be. We wore masks to keep out dust and debris, along with sweatpants and sweatshirts. Later, we looked at the photos we took that night. In one of the pictures, we noticed something odd, a figure that looked very much like a little boy around my age back then. He wasn't wearing a mask or the same kind of clothes as us. I'm not very superstitious, but it makes me wonder, what if there's something watching over me and my family? Something growing at the same rate I am? Maybe I was supposed to be a twin, but the other didn't survive. I know this comment may get buried since I'm late to the conversation, but if anyone's interested, I think the picture is still on my phone. Story 33. My dad struggled with alcohol during a big part of my childhood. There are quite a few intense memories. I remember him making me shoot a handgun at the ground when I was about 6 or 7. I was crying because I didn't want to, but he insisted. That's probably where my fear of guns came from. One time when I was around 5, he grabbed me by the collar, lifted me against the wall, and threw me out of the front door. All I could think about was my cat, Buddy, who he had just kicked out of his way. I remember running about 4 blocks before my mom happened to drive by and pick me up. I think she had left work after I called her crying. Another time, he tossed his truck keys on my bed and said he was going to shower, and that if I was bold enough, I should just leave. He had taught me to drive when I was about 8, so I did. I drove all the way across town to my mom's workplace. When I arrived, she asked where Dad was, and I told her what happened. She freaked out. Turns out my dad had already called the police and reported that I'd stolen his truck. The officers got to the point of handcuffing me in the back of a patrol car until I told them he had kicked me and given me the keys. After that, their tone changed quickly. Despite everything, I still love my dad. He turned things around when I was about 12. When he wasn't drinking, he was actually great. He brought me my favorite food when I was sick, cared about my schoolwork, and always tried to bond with me. There are so many more intense stories, but I already feel like this one might get overlooked. Story 34. I had one experience that I always thought was just a memory I made up, or maybe a dream, but it turned out to be real. I remembered being in sandy, dusty soil, grabbing at it with my tiny baby fingers. I must have been around 2 years old. I crawled to the edge of a mountain and looked down over an enormous cliff, where I saw a thick fog below. Immediately after that, I heard a lot of screaming and crying. The memory ends there. I was separated from my parents when I was 6 and went into foster care. Eventually, I got out and was reunited with my mother and father, though they were no longer together. One day, I casually mentioned this memory to my dad, and to my surprise, he confirmed that it was true. He was shocked that I even remembered it because I was so young. He said we had taken a trip to the Navajo reservation, I'm Navajo, and had visited a mountain, though I've since forgotten the name. I had apparently gotten out of my stroller and crawled toward the edge of the cliff. When they noticed, my Navajo uncle ran and grabbed me just in time, afraid I might go over. My mother was screaming and crying. He also told me something that gave him chills. The exact spot where I had been crawling was the same place where many of our people were forced off the cliff many years ago. Until I was about 15, I was very sensitive to things like spirits and energy, and I still feel a deep connection to animals. I've even been called Eliza Thornberry. Maybe it was my ancestors calling to me that day. Story 35. When I was about 4 years old, I lived in a small 2-bedroom basement apartment in a duplex with my mom and my 2 sisters. They shared one bedroom and my mom had the other, so I always slept on the couch. One night, I was lying there when I heard a scream come from my sister's room, which was down the hallway. I was covered by a blanket and I peeked out to look down the hallway. That's when I saw it, a dark gray figure hovering slowly, just inches above the floor, coming out of the hallway toward the living room, toward me. It was featureless, except for deep, dark eye sockets and what looked like a faint, lighter gray aura around its whole body. It appeared to have something like ropes or chains around its neck, dangling close to the floor. As it drifted toward me, I was frozen in fear. I couldn't move or speak. It came closer and closer. When it was about 5 feet away, I threw the blanket over my head and stayed completely still. I waited about 10 seconds before I pulled the covers off. And there it was. Its blank face with those deep sockets was just inches from mine. Then it let out the most bone-chilling sound I've ever heard. After that, I passed out and woke up the next morning with no immediate memory of the incident. Years later, I told one of my sisters about it, and she had a similar story from the same time, involving the same grayish figure. Story 36. I feel like I've been waiting my whole life for a thread like this. I've never told anyone this story out of fear that I'd sound completely out of my mind, but here goes. When I was around 12, my best friend went out of town, and I was asked to take care of his goldfish while he was gone. One afternoon, my mom and I went over to his house and let ourselves in. Halfway through checking on the fish, we heard a noise, and then turned to see a man standing at the top of the stairs. We had walked in on a burglary. My mom screamed and grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the front door. The man came running after us, but we all managed to burst out of the house. My friend's house bordered a creek, so we ran across the street and down into the ravine, while the man ran the other way. But that's not the strange part. Just as we reached the edge of the slope, I looked down and saw a massive black cat. It was enormous, easily the size of a food truck, with glowing yellow eyes. It looked straight up at us, bared its teeth, and then slinked off into the woods on the other side of the creek. I was in shock. I've never seen something so clearly that wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't particularly young, and I've never had a similar experience since. The man was later caught, and it turned out he had a gun on him. I'm not religious or especially spiritual, but deep down, I sometimes feel like I came face to face with something much bigger that day. Some part of me believes that one day, when it's my time, the last thing I'll see will be that giant black cat coming to collect what it's owed. Story 37. I'm pretty sure I levitated when I was 7. I'm not someone who usually believes in supernatural events or anything like that, but when I was younger, I really wanted to fly. I thought about it constantly. More than just wishing I had that power, I was genuinely obsessed with the idea. One day I started practicing. I would lay a few pillows on the floor, lie down on my back, and concentrate on floating. I did this for months, going into a kind of meditative state. Whenever my parents or sisters came into the room, I'd lose focus and have to try again the next day. One time, just like every other time, I started my routine. And then it happened. I lifted off the ground. I felt myself rising slowly into the air, and my heart began to race. I couldn't feel the pillows under me anymore. It scared me so much that I opened my eyes and instantly lost focus. I dropped hard onto the floor, just beside the pillows. The impact knocked the wind out of me, which had never happened to me before. I panicked and ran to my parents, convinced something was seriously wrong. When I told them what happened, they laughed it off. I still love the idea of flying, and I'm currently studying to become a pilot. But to this day, I still believe I levitated when I was a kid. Looking back, maybe I entered a really deep meditative state while focusing intensely. But I can't explain the sensation of falling, the impact next to the pillows, and the breath being knocked out of me. I probably sound crazy, and I doubt I'd ever tell this story in person, but this memory has stuck with me my entire life. Story 38. There are a couple of incidents from my childhood that still confuse me. Unfortunately, because of a difficult upbringing, I don't know exactly how old I was, but I know it was before 5th grade. The first happened when I was lying in bed. I think I had already fallen asleep, but I suddenly woke up for some reason. Floating above my bed was a woman. She glowed a bright yellowish color, so bright it actually hurt to look at her. She had long flowing yellow hair and a long dress that shimmered. She didn't say anything to me, just hovered there staring. I was completely terrified. After a moment, I managed to move just enough to pull the covers over my head. Even through the blanket, I could still see her glowing. I eventually fell back asleep under the covers. The second incident happened in the same room, also at night. I couldn't sleep and was staring out the window. Suddenly, a blue ball of light appeared in the yard. It was about the size of a beach ball. It hovered, moved slowly, and lasted for about a minute before disappearing. The third event took place at a family home in Virginia Beach, which has since been torn down. Even the adults in the house were uncomfortable being alone in certain parts of it. One night, I woke up to see a skeleton walking out of the wall toward my bed. It made its way to the foot of the bed, gripped the end, stood there for a moment, and then vanished. To this day, I have no idea what any of that was, but I'll never forget it. Story 39. I was maybe 5 or 6 when this happened. I still had to wear those inflatable arm floaties before my mom would let me go into the pool. On this particular day, they allowed me to swim in the deep end alone as long as I stayed near the edge, since they were sitting at a table fairly close to the pool. I decided to be a little rebel and let go of the edge, swimming closer to the center of the pool. No one noticed, so I took it a bit further. Inch by inch, I drifted away from the edge and felt like a grown-up swimming in the middle of the deep end. I started splashing around, nothing in particular, just being a kid. Then all of a sudden, both of my arms slipped out of the floaties, and I began to sink to the bottom of the pool. Panic set in immediately. What was I supposed to do? I technically knew how to swim, but I was frozen in fear because of how deep the water actually was. A moment later, I was resting at the bottom of the pool, looking up. But instead of feeling afraid, I felt incredibly calm. I just sat there looking around. I had never seen the pool from that perspective before. My mind was racing. I knew I needed air. I needed to get back to the surface. But I didn't move. I figured my mom would eventually notice the floaties on the surface with no kid attached. But at that moment, it didn't matter. Soon my lungs were begging for air. I slowly started to inhale. I fully expected water to rush into my mouth, but that's not what happened. I was breathing, slowly, as if I was sipping air through a coffee stirrer. I was so confused, but I stayed at the bottom of the pool, stunned by what was happening. I completely forgot about my mom or the fact that I was underwater. I was breathing underwater. Was the secret to breathe slowly? How had no one discovered this? Once I was convinced I could recreate it, I pushed off from the bottom and swam straight to the edge. Standing right there was my mom, in complete panic. She looked horrified. I grabbed the side of the pool, but before I could even take a full breath, she yanked me out of the water. I tried to explain to her that I was fine and wanted to tell her about what I had just experienced at the bottom of the pool. But she was so overwhelmed that she couldn't hear a word I was saying. She just kept going on about how dangerous it was and how scared she had been. Later on, I tried the method again. No surprise. When I inhaled slowly, all I got was a mouthful of nasty pool water. To this day, the memory is vivid and surreal. I have no idea what actually happened. A couple of years ago, I asked my mom about it. She said that as soon as she noticed I was underwater, she ran to the pool. And by the time she got there, I was already surfacing. So I still have no way of knowing how long I was actually down there. Story 40. I still have no explanation for this. My earliest memory is of waking up in the backseat of a car. What made it so strange was that I woke up with amnesia, on a highway we never returned to and had no reason to be on, at around 10 at night. I didn't recognize my parents, didn't know my own name, or how old I was. All I knew were some basic English phrases and various general facts about the world, things I shouldn't have been able to know at that age. I've never gotten a straight answer about it. Whenever I bring it up, my parents either shut me down or claim they don't remember anything about it. That entire situation and the months that followed were unsettling in ways I can't easily describe. I would black in and out of self-awareness, but people around me insisted I had been up and doing things during those periods. Some of those lost times lasted for weeks or even months, but I experienced them like they never happened. It was as if I blinked and suddenly I'd be somewhere else, days or weeks later, doing something entirely different. This went on until I was about 5 or 6, at which point my awareness became more consistent and my perception of time stabilized. But even now, it's hard to explain how deeply disturbing the whole experience was. Thinking about it still gives me an overwhelming sense that something big is coming, or that I have some kind of responsibility or task I'm meant to complete. That feeling becomes almost impossible to ignore whenever I revisit this memory.